The wind carried a dry whistle across the wide plains, a sound that seemed to echo the emptiness of the land. Dust swirled around the wagon wheels as it rolled slowly along the worn trail, pulled by a pair of tired mules. Inside the wagon sat a young girl, her hands folded in her lap, fingers twisting nervously with every jolt of the wooden frame. She was just 18, though the shadows of worry in her eyes made her look older. Her life had shifted in a way she could not control, and every mile brought her closer to a future that was not her own choosing. The old American frontier was no place for the faint of heart. Ranches were spread out across miles of prairie. Men worked the land until their backs broke, and women carried burdens heavier than their own bones could bear. In those times, arrangements were often made without a whisper of consent. Families struggling to survive saw daughters not as children but as threads of survival, threads they could bargain with to keep their lives stitched together. And so this young girl found herself sold to a man she had never met. They told her he was a rancher, a man living alone on the edge of the plains, far removed from town life. He was known for his quiet nature, a solitary figure who kept to himself. No one could say much more about him, except that his land stretched wide, and his cattle numbered plenty. To her parents, that was enough. To her, it was a fate she could not fight. She had heard stories of young brides sent into the wilderness, never to be heard from again, their lives swallowed up by the silence of the prairie. Those stories haunted her now as the wagon creaked closer to its end. Her chest tightened with every thought of the man she was promised to. Would he be cruel, rough, demanding as so many men could be in these hard lands? Or would he be distant, cold, leaving her to wander his ranch like a ghost? Fear pressed down heavier than the dusty air. She stared out at the endless grass bending in the wind and tried to imagine her place in this lonely stretch of earth. The wagon driver, an older hand with skin browned by years of sun, glanced at her once or twice but said little. There was no comfort in his silence, only a steady reminder that she was being delivered like a parcel. The sound of the wheels over dirt became a rhythm of fate she could not escape. She thought of her mother, who had kissed her cheek that morning without meeting her eyes. She thought of her father, whose handshake with the rancher had sealed her life's course. And then she thought of herself, sitting there with nothing but fear to carry. By late afternoon, the sun cast long shadows across the land. In the distance, she could see the outline of a ranch. A fence lined the fields, weathered but strong. Smoke curled from the chimney of a small wooden house set against a backdrop of hills. The mules slowed as they reached the gate, and the driver gave a sharp whistle to announce their arrival. Her heart pounded. This was it. It's the moment she had dreaded and wondered about all in the same breath. The door of the house opened and a man stepped out. He stood tall, shoulders broad from years of labor, a worn hat shading his face. His clothes were plain but neat, the kind a man wore who knew the value of hard work. He did not hurry to the wagon, nor did he show much expression. Instead, he moved with the slow steadiness of someone who had long made peace with solitude. When his eyes met hers, she quickly looked away, her throat tightening as though the air itself betrayed her. She could not tell what kind of man he was from that first glance. There was no anger in his face, but there was no warmth either. Only a stillness, like a river that ran deep and silent. He helped her down from the wagon, his hand rough but careful, steadying her as her boots touched the dirt. She could feel the strength in his grasp, but not a trace of force. That small detail unsettled her in ways she could not yet explain. The driver handed him the bag with her few belongings, tipped his hat, and left without a word. The sound of the wagon wheels faded into the distance, leaving her standing in front of the house with the man who was now her husband. The silence stretched, broken only by the distant cry of a hawk overhead. She wanted to ask something, anything, but the words would not come. He finally spoke, his voice low and steady, telling her she must be tired from the journey. Without another word, he lifted her bag and walked toward the house, pausing only long enough to glance back and make sure she followed. Inside, the house was plain but clean. The wooden walls smelled faintly of cedar, and a fire burned in the hearth, warming the small room. She saw a table, 2 chairs, and shelves stacked neatly with tools and supplies. There was no sign of luxury, but there was no sign of neglect either. He set her bag down near the bed, then stood awkwardly, as if unsure what came next. She realized then that he was not used to sharing his space with another soul. She felt the weight of the day crash down on her. She was alone with a man she did not know, far from the life she once had. And yet, as she glanced at him, something flickered deep inside her. It was not trust, not yet, but it was not fear either. It was something she could not name, something that unsettled her as much as it steadied her. That night, lying awake in the small room, she listened to the wind pressing against the walls. She thought about how her life had changed in a single day. Her parents were gone, the town was behind her, and the future stretched into unknown days beside this quiet rancher. She turned on her side, staring at the wooden beams of the ceiling, and wondered what kind of man he truly was. He had not spoken much, but his silence carried weight, as though he was keeping parts of himself hidden from the world. Questions circled her mind like restless horses. Would he ever open up to her? Would his gentle touch remain gentle? Or would the pressures of ranch life turn him hard? And what of herself? Could she learn to live in this wild place, or would it swallow her whole? The prairie was vast, and she was small. Yet something inside her stirred, something new and dangerous, like a fire sparking from a flint. The darkness pressed close around the cabin as she closed her eyes, but her heart would not settle. She sensed that the days ahead would change her in ways she could not yet understand. She did not know if she should be afraid of that change or welcome it. The sound of his footsteps shifting on the wooden floor outside the room made her hold her breath, waiting, unsure of what might come next. The night stretched long, and with it grew the tension of a life that was only beginning to unfold. Would he remain a stranger, or would he become something more? The answer hung heavy in the air, just out of reach, like the horizon at the edge of the plains. The story of her life with the lonely rancher was only beginning, and the fire that stirred in her heart had only just been lit. The morning came with a chill that crept through the cracks in the walls. She woke to the faint smell of coffee and the low crackle of firewood burning in the hearth. For a moment she forgot where she was, thinking she might still be in her parents' home, but the rough wooden ceiling above her reminded her otherwise. This was the rancher's house now, and she belonged to this place whether her heart wanted it or not. She sat up slowly, pulling the quilt tighter around her shoulders, listening to the quiet sounds of him moving about in the other room. His steps were steady, deliberate, like a man who lived by routine. She rose from the bed and smoothed her dress, careful not to make too much noise. When she stepped into the main room, she found him already at the table, setting down a tin cup filled with steaming coffee. His eyes met hers briefly, a quick glance that held no judgment, but also no welcome. He motioned toward the chair opposite him, and she took her place at the table. The silence between them was thick, broken only by the wind against the windows and the distant call of a crow. He pushed a plate toward her, a piece of bread beside a strip of smoked meat. She murmured a thank you, though her voice came out small. He nodded once but said nothing. She ate quietly, her stomach twisting with nerves more than hunger. Every bite tasted heavy, as though her body resisted this new life. She wondered if he noticed how her hands trembled as she lifted the cup. When the meal was done, he rose, set on his hat, and told her he had work in the fields. His voice was calm, even, yet it carried the weight of a man used to giving direction. He said she could tend to the house or walk the land if she wished, but to keep near until she learned the boundaries of the property. Then he was gone, the door closing behind him, leaving her in a silence so vast it pressed against her chest. She looked around the small cabin, trying to see herself in its plain walls. The shelves held tools, jars of dried goods, and a Bible worn with use. Rifle rested above the doorway, its metal catching the faint morning light. Everything in the room spoke of a man who had built his life with his own hands, but none of it spoke of warmth. She walked to the window and watched him cross the yard, his frame steady against the bright horizon. He moved with certainty, a man anchored to the land, while she felt like a leaf blown into a place that did not belong to her. The hours stretched slowly. She tried to busy herself by sweeping the floor, folding the quilt, and straightening the shelves, though they needed no straightening. The quiet gnawed at her, making every creak of the boards sound louder. Back in town there had always been noise, the chatter of neighbors, the rattle of wagons, the laughter of children. Here the silence was so deep it felt alive. By midday she stepped outside, drawn by the sun and the vast open land. The ranch spread wide, endless grass waving in the wind, broken only by a few scattered trees and the distant line of hills. A corral stood near the barn, holding a few horses that lifted their heads at her approach, their dark eyes watchful. She moved carefully, keeping to the fence, not daring to step too close. Everything here felt unfamiliar, as though the earth itself was testing her. She wondered how many years he had lived this way, with only the animals and the land for company. When he returned that afternoon, his shirt damp with sweat and dust clinging to his boots, she was back inside, trying to appear as though she belonged there. He set down his tools and washed his hands in the basin near the door. For a moment he stood there, looking at her as though considering whether to speak. Then he asked if she could cook, his tone plain, without judgment. She nodded, though her confidence wavered. She had helped her mother many times, but never had the work felt so heavy as it did now. That night she cooked for him, the smell of stew filling the cabin. He ate quietly, and when he finished, he thanked her with a short nod before retreating into silence again. The days began to follow that rhythm. He rose early, worked the land from dawn until dusk, and returned with the same quiet steadiness. She kept the house, prepared the meals, and tried to learn the ways of the ranch. Though he spoke little, she began to notice the small things. How he always removed his hat before stepping inside. How he set aside a portion of food for the animals before taking his own. How he mended broken tools with patience rather than frustration. These details unsettled her because they did not fit the picture she had carried of a man who would be harsh, demanding, or careless. At night, when the lamps burned low, she lay awake listening to the sounds of the house settling. His presence was near, steady, and strong, yet distant enough to leave her in uncertainty. He did not force words from her, nor did he offer his own. It was as though they lived side by side, yet worlds apart. The mystery of him grew with each passing day, and she found herself watching him more closely, searching for pieces of the man hidden beneath his silence. She began to learn more of the land as well. The ranch was not just wide fields, but also hidden corners that spoke of stories long before her time. A grove of trees where the ground dipped low held the remains of a fire pit, long cold. A stretch of fence bore the marks of years of repair. There was history here, though none of it was told aloud. She wondered how much of it belonged to him, and how much belonged to the generations before. The weight of that silence pressed on her, making her long for answers she could not ask. One afternoon, while gathering water from the well, she caught sight of him in the distance, standing still, as if listening to something carried by the wind. His posture was tense, different from his usual calm. She froze, unsure whether to call out. He turned suddenly, his gaze meeting hers across the distance. For a brief moment she thought she saw something flicker in his eyes, a shadow of worry or pain, but he quickly looked away and returned to his work. That image stayed with her, raising questions she dared not voice. In the evenings, she began to catch fragments of his world. Once, when the fire burned low, he told her about a storm that had nearly wiped out his cattle years before. His voice carried no self-pity, only the weight of memory. Another time he mentioned a neighbor who had once tried to buy his land, his words sharp with quiet resistance. These glimpses were rare, like cracks in a wall, and each one left her more curious than before. Her own heart was changing too. At first she had been filled with fear, but as the days passed, that fear shifted into something else. It was not comfort, not yet, but a restless pull she could not explain. His silence no longer felt empty, but full of things unspoken. She began to wonder if he carried secrets, burdens he kept locked away. Perhaps that was why he lived alone, why he spoke so little. Perhaps there were ghosts on this land, and he was bound to them. Still, she did not know her own place here. She was no longer the girl who had left her parents' home, yet she did not feel like a woman rooted in this land either. She was caught between walking the narrow line between fear and curiosity, between duty and desire. Each morning, she rose to face the same quiet, the same unanswered questions, and each night she lay awake, listening, waiting, sensing that something lay just beyond reach. The prairie itself seemed to share in that tension. The wind carried whispers that tugged at her. The open sky held promises she could not name. There was beauty in the land, but there was also danger, the kind that hid beneath stillness. She felt it every time she saw his shadow cross the doorway, every time his eyes lingered on her for a moment too long before he turned away. The days turned to weeks, but the mystery only deepened. She did not yet know if he would remain a stranger or if he would become something more. She only knew that the silence between them was changing, growing heavier, filled with questions that could not stay unanswered forever. The fire that had been lit within her was no longer a spark. It was slowly growing, fed by the unknown, by the quiet strength of the man who now shared her life, and by the land itself, wild and untamed. But the answers she longed for remained hidden, waiting. And as the sun set over the endless fields, painting the sky in shades of gold and red, she felt the weight of what was to come pressing on her heart. Something was stirring in the quiet, something that would not remain in the shadows much longer. The days on the ranch kept to their rhythm. Yet beneath the stillness, a quiet unease was growing. She could feel it every time she watched the rancher work, his hands steady on the reins, his steps sure as he moved across the land. He was a man of routine, a man who carried himself with calm control, but there were moments when his eyes betrayed something else. Shadow lingered there, as though he was carrying burdens too heavy for silence alone. She wanted to ask him about it, but the words never seemed to form. Instead, she kept her distance, letting the questions build inside her like storm clouds on the horizon. The main conflict in her heart was simple, yet sharp. She had been sold into this life, handed over without choice, and though he had shown her no cruelty, the fact of it weighed on her. She was both grateful for his gentleness and resentful of the chain that had brought her here. She felt torn between fear of what he might become and curiosity about the man he truly was. At night, lying awake, she thought of the life she might have had elsewhere, and yet each morning she found herself searching his face for answers she could not name. One evening, as the sun dropped low and the sky burned orange, she carried water to the porch and saw him sitting there, hat in his lap, staring at the far hills. His posture was rigid, his jaw tight, and though he did not speak, she could sense that something troubled him. She lingered at the doorway, wondering if she should step closer, but he rose suddenly and walked off toward the barn, leaving her with more questions than before. The land itself carried tension too. Strange signs began to appear around the ranch. Once, she found the gate left open, though she was certain it had been closed. Another morning, she noticed tracks near the corral that did not belong to their horses. When she mentioned it to him, his face darkened, though he said little beyond telling her to stay near the house. That silence frightened her more than words ever could. It was not only strangers she worried about. The distance between her and the rancher was its own kind of conflict. They lived side by side, yet their lives did not fully touch. She longed for a moment of honesty, a chance to know the man beneath the quiet, but he kept himself guarded. His gentleness was real, she knew, but it was like a wall built of care instead of stone, keeping her near enough to feel safe, but far enough to keep her from knowing him. That half-truth unsettled her, leaving her caught between trust and suspicion. She found herself drawn to the animals, perhaps because they did not keep secrets. The horses responded to her with cautious curiosity, their dark eyes following her every step. Cattle were steady, slow, their presence grounding her when her thoughts grew restless. She began spending hours near the corral, whispering softly to the horses, as if they might understand her fears. Sometimes she imagined they did, their ears twitching, as though they were listening more closely than any person had. It was during one of these afternoons that she saw him again, standing at a distance, watching her as she stroked the muzzle of a chestnut mare. His expression was unreadable, his eyes shadowed beneath the brim of his hat. When she turned to face him, he looked away quickly and busied himself with a broken fence. That moment lingered with her, a silent admission that perhaps he too was caught in the same web of questions. The neighbors were far and few, but word still traveled across the prairie. Once a week, he would ride into town for supplies, leaving her behind. Those were the longest days, the house pressing in on her with its heavy quiet. She wondered what stories people told about him there. Did they know about the deal her father had made? Did they whisper about her, the young bride sent to live with a man twice her age in the middle of nowhere? The thought unsettled her, yet part of her longed to hear their words, even if they cut deep. Anything would be better than silence. She began to notice his habits on those trips. He always left before dawn, and returned after dark, his face unreadable, his words fewer than usual. His clothes carried the faint scent of tobacco, though he did not smoke at home. Sometimes his hands shook slightly, just for a moment, before he clenched them into stillness again. She wondered if his trips to town brought him trouble, or if trouble was already on its way back with him. The conflict between them deepened when she asked, one evening, if he had family. The question hung in the air, heavy and sharp. He looked at her for a long time, then said only that he once had a brother, before rising and walking outside into the dark. That was the first time she had seen true pain in his eyes, and it left her shaken. She wanted to know more, but she feared pushing him further into silence. The land itself seemed to grow restless as autumn neared. The nights turned colder, the wind sharper, carrying with it a sense of unease. Coyotes cried in the distance more often than before, their howls echoing across the empty fields. She found herself waking in the night, heart racing, as though the walls of the cabin could not keep the outside world at bay. Sometimes she thought she heard footsteps beyond the door, though when she looked, there was nothing but the endless dark. One night she rose to fetch water and saw him standing at the window, rifle in hand, his eyes scanning the horizon. He did not notice her at first, and when she asked what was wrong, he shook his head, telling her to go back to bed. But she saw the way his jaw tightened, the way his grip on the rifle did not ease. Whatever haunted him was real, and it was drawing nearer. Her own thoughts were no less troubled. She wondered if this was the life she would live forever. Caught between silence and secrets, with the land pressing down on her until she could no longer breathe. Yet she also felt something stirring in her, a fire she could not deny. It was not love, not yet, but it was a pull toward him, a need to understand the man who had become the center of her world. That need frightened her almost as much as the shadows gathering around them. One afternoon, as she gathered herbs near the grove, she found a carving on the trunk of an old oak. It was weathered by time, but she could make out two initials crossed together. They were not his, nor hers. She traced the letters with her fingers, wondering whose hands had left them there, and why he had never mentioned it. When she asked him about the grove later, he grew still and said only that it was not a place she should linger. His eyes were distant as he spoke, his voice quieter than usual, as if the memory itself carried weight. The tension grew with each passing day, layering over their lives like dust on the windowsill. She wanted to break through the silence, to demand answers, but fear held her back. Fear of what she might uncover, fear of how the truth might change everything between them. Still, she could not stop herself from watching him more closely, from searching for clues in his every glance, his every movement. And he, in turn, seemed to watch her too. At times she caught him studying her when he thought she did not see. His expression unreadable, his eyes carrying a depth she could not yet reach. It was as though they were both caught in the same current, pulled toward one another yet unable to close the distance. The prairie was vast, the silence heavy, and the secrets unspoken. The conflict between them was not only about the past that clung to him, or the deal that had brought her here, but about the uncertain road ahead. She felt it every time the wind swept across the land, every time his shadow fell across the doorway. Something was coming, something that would test both of them in ways neither was prepared for. And as the days stretched into longer nights, the tension between them grew, waiting for the moment when silence would no longer be enough to keep the truth buried. The season began to shift, and with it the tone of life on the ranch. The air turned colder, nights longer, and a silence fell heavier than before. She could feel the change in him as much as in the land. He grew more guarded, more restless, rising at odd hours to walk the boundary of the ranch, always with his rifle in hand. His movements were sharper, quicker, as though he expected something or someone to appear out of the dark at any moment. She felt the tension pressing against her like the weight of a storm not yet broken. Her own heart was caught between fear and a strange kind of loyalty. She wanted to understand him, to ask why shadows seemed to follow him, but the words stuck in her throat. Every time she thought she might reach him, his silence closed the space again. Yet the questions grew louder inside her. She wondered about the carving on the oak, the brother he had once mentioned, the look in his eyes when he thought no one was watching. Secrets hung in the air, shaping every step of their days. One evening, she heard horses in the distance while he was out near the barn. At first, she thought it was only the wind carrying sound, but then came the distinct rhythm of hooves across hard ground. She froze, standing near the window, listening. He returned a moment later, his face hard, eyes sharp. Did not ask if she had heard. He simply told her to lock the door and not open it until he said so. The way his voice cut through the quiet made her chest tighten. She obeyed, but when she pressed her ear against the door, she caught only fragments of his low voice carried into the night. There were no answers, only a deeper sense that something dangerous was moving closer. After that night, he grew more watchful. He checked the fences twice, sometimes 3 times a day. Rode farther, returning later, his face lined with worry he would not explain. She began to sense that the land itself was divided between what he controlled and what he feared. The open horizon no longer seemed endless but full of unseen threats. When she asked if neighbors might be behind the strange tracks and sounds, his jaw tightened, and he shook his head, saying only that it was not neighbors he worried about. Her mind turned again and again to the brother he had spoken of only once. She wondered if that shadow from his past had something to do with the fear in his eyes now. Perhaps there had been a betrayal, or a debt left unpaid, or worse. She wanted to press him for the truth, but the fear of breaking the fragile calm between them kept her silent. Still, every time she saw him stand at the window at night, watching the horizon with his rifle leaning against the frame, she knew whatever haunted him was not gone. It was waiting. The nights grew colder, the wind sharper, rattling the shutters like hands trying to force their way in. She lay awake, staring at the wooden beams above, her heart beating fast at every sound. The tension between them no longer came only from the unspoken questions, but from the sense that danger was closing in. The fire inside her grew with it, not just fear, but determination. She needed to know what he carried, needed to understand before whatever was coming reached their door. One afternoon, while he was away mending fence, she returned to the grove where the oak stood. She could not keep herself from it, as though the tree held answers he refused to give. The initials carved into the bark seemed deeper now, sharper against the pale wood. She traced them with her hand again, and this time she noticed something she had not before: the faint outline of another mark beneath, almost scratched away as though someone had tried to erase it. Her breath caught, and she stepped back, her heart pounding. That carving was no careless mark. It was a piece of his story, one he had buried but not destroyed. When he returned that evening, she wanted to tell him what she had found, but his expression stopped her cold. His eyes were dark, his steps heavy, and without a word he set his rifle against the wall and sat at the table, silent. She poured coffee, her hands trembling, and for a long while neither spoke. Then, quietly, he said, "They might need to be ready to leave, if things turned worse." The thought of leaving the ranch, the place that had begun to shape her life, filled her with fear and confusion. But the way he said it left no doubt. The threat was real, and it was closing in. The next morning, she woke to the sound of raised voices outside. She rushed to the window and saw 2 men on horseback near the gate, their figures dark against the early light. He stood facing them, his shoulders squared, his stance rigid. Though she could not hear their words clearly, she could feel the weight of the exchange. One of the men leaned forward in his saddle, pointing toward the house, and her stomach dropped. Whatever they wanted, it involved her too. He shook his head firmly, his voice carrying sharp through the air, and after a tense moment the men turned their horses and rode off. But his face, when he returned, was pale with a fury she had never seen before. He would not speak of it, not fully. He only told her to stay inside, to keep the doors bolted and to trust him. But she could not ignore the way his hands trembled when he set his rifle back on the wall, or the way his eyes avoided hers. Something about those men had cut deeper than he wanted her to know. That night, the tension between them nearly broke. She told him she could not live in silence, not when danger was at their very door. Her voice shook, but she pressed on, demanding to know who those men were, why they had come, and what he was keeping from her. For a long the moment he stared at her, his face torn between anger and pain. Then, with a voice rougher than she had ever heard from him, he told her that the past was not as far away as she might think. He did not explain more, but the way he looked at her then made her heart twist. It was not only fear of danger she saw in him, but fear of losing her. After that night, the ranch no longer felt like a safe place. Every sound outside made her startle, every shadow stretched too long. She kept close to the window, her eyes searching the horizon, waiting for the riders to return. She felt as though she had been pulled into a story larger than herself, one written long before she ever stepped foot on the ranch. And though she did not yet know the full truth, she could feel it pressing closer, a storm ready to break. The animals grew restless too. The horses shied at shadows, the cattle lowed in the night as if unsettled by something unseen. The land seemed to hold its breath. She began to wonder if perhaps the ranch itself carried curses, bound to the choices of those who lived on it. But deeper than that fear was a stronger one, that he would not let her in before it was too late. The final thread of calm snapped when she woke one night to the sound of horses again. This time, it was no passing travelers. The hoofbeats circled the house, steady, deliberate, then fell into silence. She clutched the quilt to her chest, heart pounding, as he rose from his chair, rifle in hand. He motioned for her to stay back, his eyes fierce. She could hear the slow creak of leather outside, the murmur of voices too low to catch. The air felt tight, the firelight flickering across the walls as though even the flames were afraid. She wanted to run, to hide, but her legs would not move. She watched him at the door, his shoulders stiff, his finger near the trigger. The silence stretched unbearably, broken only by the distant sound of a horse pawing the ground. She could feel that everything, the secrets, the shadows, the fire between them, was rushing toward this moment. She did not know what would come next, only that the life she had known was about to change forever. And then came the knock at the door, slow, deliberate, echoing through the cabin, until it seemed to shake the very walls. She held her breath, her heart racing so fast she thought it might tear through her chest. He stood frozen, his hand on the latch, the weight of the decision pressing down. The fire crackled once, then died low. Outside, the wind howled across the empty land. Inside, the tension coiled tighter than it had ever been. The moments stretched, unbearable, as she waited to see whether he would open the door, and what waited for them on the other side. The knock echoed through the cabin again, slow and steady, rattling the silence until it seemed to shake her bones. She clutched the edge of the quilt tighter, her breath caught in her throat as the rancher stood at the door, his rifle steady in his hands. For a long moment he did not move. The firelight flickered over his face, showing the strain there, the weight of choices he had been carrying for years. She had never seen him hesitate before, but now he stood between past and present, and she knew it was not the riders outside he feared most, but the truth waiting to be spoken. At last he pulled the latch and swung the door open. The cold air rushed in, and there stood the two men she had seen before, their figures dark against the moonlight. They stepped forward, their eyes sharp, their faces worn by dust and distance. One of them spoke, his voice edged with anger. But what unsettled her most was the way the rancher's shoulders sagged slightly, as if he had known this meeting could not be avoided. The man on horseback dismounted, pointing at him, words spilling out about debts unpaid and blood that had not yet settled. She could not catch every detail, but she understood enough. The past he had kept hidden was no simple tale of hardship. It was tied to men who carried grudges across miles, grudges that now stood at their door. For the first time, she saw him speak with fire. His voice, usually calm, was rough with anger as he told them he had left that life behind, that he owed them nothing now. But the other man's sneer said otherwise. She gripped the edge of the table, torn between fear and a rising urge to stand beside him. The standoff stretched, broken only by the restless snort of the horses outside. At last, the man gave a final warning, his words sharp as a blade, promising this was not over. Then he mounted again, and the two riders disappeared into the night, their silhouettes swallowed by the horizon. The door shut behind them with a heavy thud, and the cabin seemed smaller than ever, filled with the weight of what had just passed. He stood in the middle of the room, rifle still in his hand, chest rising and falling with steady breaths. She waited, heart racing for him to speak. When he finally did, his voice was softer than before, tired and worn. He told her those men had once been close, men he had trusted when he was young. They had worked together, lived hard lives together, but greed and anger had torn them apart. His brother had been caught in the middle of it, and when violence came, it had taken his brother's life. He had walked away then, built the ranch to escape it, but some things refused to stay buried. As he spoke, she understood the silence he had carried all this time. It was not distance born of cruelty, but of pain. He had not spoken of it because the words themselves reopened wounds that had never healed. Yet now in the quiet of the cabin, he gave her the truth, piece by piece, his eyes never leaving hers. Her fear softened into something else. She saw not just the man who had bought her through an arrangement, but a man who had built his world on loss and carried it with quiet dignity. For the first time since arriving, she felt the distance between them shift. It was still wide, but it was no longer unbridgeable. The days that followed were tense, yet different. The threat of those men hung over them, but the truth between them gave her a kind of strength she had not known before. He began to speak more, not much, but enough. He told her stories of the early days on the ranch, of storms that nearly broke him, of nights spent alone with only the cattle and the stars for company. She shared pieces of her own life, two memories of her mother's laughter, of small joys in a town she would never return to. The silences between them no longer felt empty, but filled with things still growing. The land seemed to reflect the change. Cattle settled again, the horses calmer, though the wide prairie still carried its restless wind. She spent more time near the corral, sometimes with him beside her, showing her how to handle the reins, or how to move gently around a nervous mare. His patience surprised her, his hands steady, even when hers fumbled. She began to see the way his gentleness was not weakness, but strength built from years of hardship. The riders never returned, though the threat lingered like a shadow at the edge of the horizon. But she no longer lived in fear of it alone. She had learned the weight of his silence and the reason for his guarded ways, and in knowing it, she felt herself changing too. She was no longer the frightened girl who had stepped off the wagon weeks before. She was becoming something stronger, shaped by the land, by the trials, and by the man who stood beside her in the quiet hours of the night. One evening, as the sun set across the plains, he stood on the porch, his hat in his hands, watching the horizon as he always did. She stepped beside him, the air cool against her skin, the sky painted in shades of red and gold. For a long moment neither spoke. Then he turned to her, his eyes softer than she had ever seen, and told her that whatever storm came, he would face it with her. The words were simple, but they settled deep in her heart, steady and sure. The fire inside her, once only a spark, now burned steady. It was not the fire of fear, but of strength, of belonging. She had not chosen this life, but she had found a place within it. And in him she saw not just a rancher, but a man learning, like her, how to face the future with hope. The ranch remained quiet in the weeks that followed. Men did not return, though she suspected they might one day. But the fear of it no longer held her captive. She had come to see that life on the plains was never without danger, never without loss. What mattered was not the shadows that lingered, but the choice to face them with courage. When the first snow fell, blanketing the land in silence, she stood at the window watching the world turn white. Behind her, he stoked the fire, his movements steady as always. Yet now the silence between them felt warm, filled not with secrets but with shared understanding. She knew the road ahead would not be easy, but it would be theirs, and that was enough. The story of her life had begun in fear, a girl sold into a future she did not choose. But it had grown into something else, shaped by the quiet strength of a man who carried pain yet offered gentleness. And by the land itself, vast and unforgiving, but also full of promise. She realized then that sometimes fate led to places we did not expect. And in those places, we found the parts of ourselves we never knew were waiting. As the snow continued to fall, she turned from the window and walked toward him. He looked up, his eyes catching hers, and in that simple moment the distance between them finally closed. The fire burned steady in the hearth, the wind whistled against the walls, and the vast land outside stretched endless and untamed. But inside the cabin there was warmth, there was strength, and there was a beginning that no storm could take away. The lonely rancher was no longer a stranger, and she, once a frightened girl brought to a place she had not chosen, had found something unexpected in the wide silence of the prairie. Not just survival, but a home, and the start of a life built not on fear, but on fire.